and then have to coordinate among each other and also with the United States to do what U.S. solely used to do.
It's not only about defense cooperation and military issues, but it's also about economic issues. It's also about human-to-human exchange.
Hello, and welcome to a special talk event on diplomacy and security in Asia. Today we're looking at one of the most important relationships in the region, the alliance between the United States and Japan, its evolution, its challenges, and its relevance in a changing world. I'm Jonathan Soble, former Tokyo bureau chief at the Financial Times, currently a partner at Kreab Japan, a strategic communications company here in Tokyo. With me today as my co-host is Professor Satoru Mori of Keio University. He's deputy head of the Keio Center for Strategy, which is a new hub established at Keio to facilitate international collaboration on issues related to security and strategy. It's great to be with you today. Before we dive in, maybe you could tell us a little bit about KCS.
Thank you very much for having me. Keio Center for Strategy is a university-based think tank that was established in March 2023. It is devoted to promoting discussion and debate among not only academics and policymakers, but also among people from the private sector about issues regarding geopolitics, strategy, and economic security. Basically, we are devoted to addressing around-the-corner issues and make a policy recommendation. Also, we are devoted to raising public awareness on some of these issues. So we hold public events, and we were fortunate enough to have very high-profile political figures from abroad. For example, we had NATO Secretary General Mr. Stoltenberg, and also South Korean President Mr. Yoon come over to our institution and gave their addresses. And also, we are promoting networks between not only universities in Japan, but between Keio University and universities abroad. And so this is aimed to sort of nurture the next generation of academics who will be well-versed in some of the major policy issues of the day. So that is Keio Centers for Strategy. Thank you.
So now let me introduce our special guest for today, Ayumi Teraoka of Columbia University. Dr. Teraoka is a postdoctoral research scholar at the Japan Research Program at the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia. She's an expert on international security, alliance politics, and Japanese foreign policy. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you all for having me here today. I'm very excited to join the conversations to talk about U.S. Japan relations and the future of Indo-Pacific security. Happy to be here.
Great. The U.S. Japan alliance has been around since the early 1950s. It's regularly described by both sides in terms that make it sound almost as old and unchanging as the pyramids. It's the cornerstone. It's of peace and security in the region. So let me start by asking you what's new. What makes the alliance a relevant topic for someone like yourself who's interested in international relations?
Great. Thank you for your questions. I think what makes U.S.-Japan alliance interesting today is that despite the fact that it's been around for more than 70 years, just like any other relationship that lasts for that long, the nature and the purpose of the institution is shifting to meet the demands of each era and sort of the people's demand of the time. So the phrases you mentioned, like cornerstone, bedrock, those are sort of public diplomacy phrases that officials use to sell the institution's benefit to the people of both countries, but also to signal to the potential adversaries and rivals in the region to look kind of emphasize the strength of and the unity of alliance. But I think that also signals to the fact that the alliance support was still contested in both countries. The fact that government officials had to kind of emphasize the value publicly shows that that kind of public diplomacy was so fundamental to the relationship because public support was contested. I think today there's less need for that. I think people fundamentally understand the value of the alliance because of external challenges facing the alliance. I think the U.S.-Japan alliance today has become a lot more security focused threat-based institution, just like any other traditional security alliances is. And this really has shifted over the last decade or so as US and Japan started to share threat perceptions and kind of common challenges facing United States and Japan together. So I think that's really new development, actually. Despite the fact that it's been around for more than 70 years, I think the nature it has shifted over the last decade or so. And I would say that one of the defining moments for Japan was tensions in East China Sea in 2010. That just made people in Japan realize there's an existential threat to its territorial integrity. There's a huge power rising in the neighborhood that might have the capability and intent to destabilize the region. And about 2015 or so, when the United States also realized with the development in the South China Sea that China might have broader interest, broader kind of interest in changing the status quo in the region in a way that kind of destabilizes the region and threatens its allies and interests of the United States in the region. So I think alliance has been shifting, and I think we face new challenges of preparing the institution to be more threat-focused institution today.
So if the challenges to the alliance in the past were internal and had a lot to do with divisions in society and the fact that not everyone supported the alliance, now that's less of an issue, but we have external challenges, and we're gonna get into that. Do you think that's a way of characterizing it?
Yes, I think that's certainly true. And one other remarkable aspect about the Japan-US alliance is that it is multifaceted. It's not only about defense cooperation and military issues, but it's also about economic issues. It's also about human-to-human exchange and so forth. So when these challenges arise, starting from maritime security to defense buildup, to technology, human rights, and economic security, the alliance has been very responsive to these newly emerging issues. And I think this is not easy. We often take this for advantage, but it shows the strength and depth of the U.S.-Japan relationship. And that has what has actually enabled both countries to respond to the changes in the external environment. So I would add that aspect also as well in terms of why the alliance is new. Yeah.
If you're looking at the United States from Asia, I think one of the big questions of the last few years has been about the depth of U.S. commitment to the region. We're always hearing from Washington that Asia is where it's at. It's where the United States is refocusing its resources, its attention, and yet there are other things that always seem to be in the way, to get in the way of that, whether it's Ukraine or the Middle East. And meanwhile, the increasing influence of China seems to put the U.S. more and more on the back foot. So let's talk about the U.S. side of this first. Dr. Teraoka, how do you evaluate U.S. commitment and engagement in Asia in the last few years?
I believe that U.S. commitment to Asia remains pretty strong. I think if you look at who sits in the government and runs foreign policy making in D.C., these people are, for example, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of State Carl Campbell, Eli Ratner. These at the Pentagon, they're all true Asia hands. They've studied Asia. They've been being involved in Asia policy for more than 20, 30 years, depending on who we are talking about. These people actually have been talking about the importance of Asia since 1990s. I think that tells something. Despite the fact, for example, Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, might have to engage in broader issues of global challenges as he heads this huge institution and country, and the U.S. remains to be a global actor. But the fact that these people, by nature, understand that that's where U.S. interest also lies and is fundamental. And their experience also shape their perceptions of how they engage allies in Asia. I think that matters truly. And to be honest, I think that Japan wants U.S. to be global power. I think Japan wants U.S. to be not just looking at Asia, but also be constructive leader, in solving global issues. And I think the people in Japan also understand, or people in Asia understand, that U.S. leadership in other parts of the world is also a signal to potential rivals in Asia. So I think it's a matter of fact that U.S. just needs to engage in multiple theaters, and I do think the U.S. commitment to Asia still remains pretty strong. The issue is the domestic polarization. I think fundamentally U.S. faces deep division about how they want to use their power globally. And I think sort of division between Republicans and Democrats can't come together, and they kind of tend to prioritize their domestic division over their common interests abroad. So I think that kind of detracts the power of the United States when they engage in foreign policy abroad. But the implication of that is, U.S. is still interested in Asia, just has so many global engagements with relative declining power, with domestic division. So the implication for allies is that allies have to do a lot more, either in Asia or Europe or Middle East. I think these allies have to do more, and then have to coordinate among each other, and also with the United States to do what U.S. solely used to do. I think that's a matter of fact.
So U.S. engagement is a supply issue and a demand issue. And I think you're saying in Japan, there's certainly the demand for the U.S. to stay engaged in Asia now, especially among policymakers, security people. The supply side question is a little bit tricky. You have people in place who want to do it, a public that's not necessarily united behind that goal. What do you think about that?
Yeah, U.S. is a global power with global interests. So in a sense, you can never have enough resources and attention to deal with all the issues. So I think what is important is prioritization. And there, I think, if you look at the past history, starting from the end of the Second World War, actually, U.S. has had to deal with the three theaters, right? Europe, Middle East, and East Asia. I guess my sense is that until the early 2000s, the primary theater of interest for the United States was Europe. And as many of us know, beginning with probably the Obama administration, there was this rising awareness in Washington that the center of economic growth has now shifted to East Asia, or now we call it Indo-Pacific region. And as a result, I think there has been a more strong commitment, and especially the fact that China's rise is creating a lot of challenges, reinforces that kind of prioritization notion. And as a result, I think we can say that even though we do have the war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East, U.S. is fully committed to engaging the region, both not only economically, but also on military terms and so forth. So there, I think the U.S. commitment is strong. But on the other hand, as Teraoka-san mentioned, a little worry or concern on our side is the strength of U.S. commitment to engage the outside world itself. And so there are voices that call for devoting more resources, national resources, for domestic purposes rather than external foreign policy purposes. So that is sort of a gradually rising concern, to be honest, in Japan, I would say.
And that may explain some of the background for my next question, which is about how Japan's role within the alliance is changing. Dr. Teraoka, you mentioned allies doing more. Japan certainly has taken up that call within the last about 2 years. It's been a major shift in Japanese defense policy, increase in spending, an increase in the capabilities that Japan is looking to acquire. Can you tell us a little bit about that, the background, and how you say it's going?
Great, yeah, happy to. I think in terms of major background in prompting these defense initiatives by Japan is its deteriorating security environment. There's looming threat of contingency around Taiwan. Korean threat remains strong and persistent with a growing nuclear arsenal by North Korea. Russian invasion of Ukraine just signaled that Russia that traditional violation of sovereignty is still possible. And the fact that, Japan's attempt to peel away Russia from China just never worked. I think under Abe, the Japanese government tried to really forge a relationship with Russia so that at least we have sort of stabilized the relationship on the northern side as we are surrounded by I would say hostile neighbors surrounding Japan. But that failed also. So I think just the external environment just explains the motivation behind Japan's ownership and leadership in these defense reforms. Yeah, I think the fact that U.S. is busy and have relatively limited supplies for being committed that they can use for foreign policy just means that they are allowing allies to take more leadership roles, and they welcome these roles by allies. So I think that Japan's sort of filling in that vacuum. And then thirdly, I think what's most important is Japan over the last 70, 75 years have focused its diplomatic capitals in reconciling with its own war legacy with its neighbors. And I think over that time, I think Japan has succeeded in some aspects and failed in some aspects and still working on it. But the fact that countries like Australia has agreed to engage on defense cooperation with Japan opens up sort of more venues of defense cooperation for Japan to engage other than the United States. So now Japan has multiple partners that would be willing to work with Japan on defense issues. Either Australia, UK, France, India, all these countries, they're willing to work with Japan now. So I think that true reconciliation of history legacy, I think is sort of one underlining feature of this development also.
I want to talk about other countries in a second because I think that's an important part of how the alliance and its environment is shifting. But I just want to follow up and ask, a few years ago, I think if a Japanese government had announced effectively a doubling of defense spending and the acquiring of new capabilities, potential for a strike capability, the outcry would have been both domestic, but also, foreign, and it would have been all about remilitarization, that kind of thing. You don't hear that much about that this time, and that speaks to the changing environment you're talking about. Instead, when I hear people talking about the challenges to can they really do this, it almost feels more practical, right? Do they have the manpower? You can allocate the budget, but can you build the weapons? Do you have the defense industry capability? Is that the right reading of this? Are there practical challenges, or are there still more philosophical challenges to deal with? I'm going to ask you both.
I would just add that I think that's a really important contrast from what has been in the past. Japan's defense policy making was like. It was a lot of domestic opposition against it. And there was a lot of concerns for the regional neighbors as well. I think both changed. I think generationally, Japanese population have changed, right? I think people who have experienced war have passed away or in aging. The younger generations have grown up in an environment that they face different role for Japan and Japan's military statecraft. So I think that's fundamentally a factor. I do think that there is some sort of interesting question to be asked about why this defense reform was so smooth under Kishida government, but not under Abe government, when Abe government was trying to, reinterpret its constitution to allow for the limited exercise of right to collective self-defense. I do think that Kishida had easier time sort of proceeding with these changes that Abe envisioned in the past. I have a paper actually coming up soon about explaining perhaps that Kishida's sort of dovish image was very helpful in putting through these defense reforms. And I do think that might be true. I think there are various factors, of course, explaining that could be explaining these factors. But I think domestic environment, international environment changed, and there's less reactions or opposition against Japan taking up more role on defense issues.
Yeah, the salesman matters as much as the sales environment, and particularly if someone has a perceived agenda or not. What do you think? Challenges? Are we done with the philosophy and now it's practical, or there's still more to do?
Yeah, I think it's more practical. Back in 2017, I was part of this team that rolled out this policy recommendation for GDP 1.2% increase in the defense budget, defense budget. And many people said, no way. And that was the kind of reaction we got. But I think two ingredients behind this new national security activism. One would be obviously the Chinese military buildup. And the second one, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think this Russian invasion of Ukraine had a major impact on the Japanese domestic public opinion in the sense that, a major power that is seated in the National UN Security Council can actually engage in unprovoked aggression. And this came as a shock to the Japanese public, I think. We oftentimes think that, aggression will come as a result of some sort of provocative action. But this was not the case in the case of Ukraine, right? And as a result, I think people came to realize that what is necessary is deterrence. And I think as a result of that, there has been strong public support to increase the defense budget in order to prevent war rather than remain as a sort of a vulnerable state exposed to any sort of military aggression. The meaning of this, if I may, sort of develop this discussion into the context of the U.S. Japan alliance, is that traditionally Japan has had this defense strategy, which is basically aiming to preserve the status quo through deterrence. And this defensive strategy is composed of two kinds of operations. One is defensive operations, and the other one is offensive operations. And the traditional division of labor between the United States and Japan was that Japan would assume the defensive operation and the U.S. forces would assume the offensive operations. We call this the American Spear and the Japanese Shield. The new strategy that was adopted in December 2022 essentially introduces two new kinds of capabilities, which kind of stands out. And those are, one is counter-strike capabilities, and the other one is active cyber defense. And this goes beyond sort of the traditional defensive operations and kind of goes into a sort of a limited offensive operations in the sense. I think that at the end of this, defense capability buildup on the part of Japan is for Japan to assume a larger role in its strategy to defend its own country, basically. So assuming more role in the offensive operation side. And as a result of that, U.S. forces will be freed up and they will be able to focus more on the defense of Taiwan. So the end state basically means that we are sort of shifting from a functional division of labor within the narrow context of defense of Japan into a sort of a regional context of a theater division of labor, where Japan will be fully capable of defending its own territory, while the United States will be able to fully commit more towards the defense of Taiwan. And so this is a sort of a new game changer. I mean, official explanation is that the division of labor between Japan and the United States will not change because they're not going to revise the Japan-U.S. Defense Cooperation Guidelines. But this is basically rooted in a sort of a legal context because guidelines are revised when you have a legal revision. And this time that's not going to happen. But strategically speaking, this kind of change, the kind of change that I mentioned earlier, is probably going to happen at the end of maybe 10 years, 15 years down the road. And so that's the significance, I think, of Japan going after this, fundamentally bolstering its defense capability.
So it's a fundamental rethinking of the way Japan and the U.S. think about deterrence.
Yes, and regional security, right.
Now, of course, Japan and the U.S. aren't the only countries in the region. Even with China, that's not the whole picture. There is a whole network of other countries that are increasingly becoming part of, if not the formal alliance system, certainly the way Japan and the U.S. look at security in the region, with new institutions like the Quad, which involves Australia and India as well. You have defense development programs where Japan is cooperating with the UK and Italy on jet fighters, for example. So it seems like this kind of hub and spoke type system where the US was the hub and Japan was one of the spokes is now changing into something a little bit more like a network where lots of different countries are working together with each other. Is that the right way to look at things, and how does that change the way the U.S.-Japan alliance works and relates to other parts of the Indo-Pacific security structure?
Yeah, I think I agree with you that sort of having a spoke system that we conventionally think of sort of U.S. alliance system in Asia is definitely changing. I mean, all these security pacts were forged in the shadow of the end of World War II, when U.S. had overwhelming power to offer security guarantees to these various partners in Asia, and these partners had little kind of cooperative agreements or relationship among each other. That's changing. As I said, U.S. doesn't have overwhelming power. U.S. is willing to let these countries work with each other also. And there is also sort of rise of the rest concept that these powers also accumulating wealth and power, so they can work with each other a lot more. And I think I would say that not only that, I think there's aspect about changing nature of threat. So for example, NATO, has this collective security environment where attack on one is attack on all, but it's also an alliance based in among continental powers. When there is a huge invasion by Russia, for example, so that all these countries face the same threat coming from Russia, but Asia, it's geographically sparse. And in oceans kind of dividing these countries. But now the threat is more not just land-based border invasion, but it's also about cyber. It's also about economic espionage. It's also about space and then technological cooperation. So there's a lot more venue for these countries that are still geographically sparse to work together. So I think these partnerships are important because the nature of threat is also changing, and there's so much more that these partners can do to address the shared challenges.
Not all countries have the same idea of the threat or its origin, though, especially in Asia. I think the rise of China has been the biggest change in the landscape. But if you look, for example, at how Japan or Australia sees that and how that's viewed in, say, Southeast Asia, it can be a lot more complicated. Japan came up with this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is a kind of philosophy or guiding principle that on one level is meant to kind of bind everyone in the region behind some common principles that we can agree on. It's been an easier sell in some places than in other places. Tell me a little bit about that, and tell me what's necessary to win over the more skeptical countries to this idea.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think these countries in Asia still vary in regime types and so level of economic development, level of sort of age of population, and so these countries have different needs and different at the different levels attracted to Chinese market, for example, or more vulnerable to Chinese economic coercion, for example. But I think fundamentally, these countries still do share the interest in sort of preserving their sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that doesn't really differ regardless of the size of economy or size of country. So I think the most important thing to attract these countries' support to a free and open Indo-Pacific concept, for example, is to focus on that. So basically to provide more capacity building support for these countries so that they can sort of fend off pressures from Chinese maritime ships coming into their borders, for example. And so I think that sort of approach to address the biggest common denominator among these states. And so I think that's most important when we think about Southeast Asian countries, that they care about national sovereignty. They don't necessarily want to choose between China or United States, or even India and Japan. I don't think they want to choose, but they do want to preserve their national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So I think we should address those concerns and listen to what they want out of the partnership from Japan and the United States. So that's one. But at the same time, with countries that share more economic development, for example, Australia, Japan, Japan and the UK, then we can do a lot more. So, the fighter jet investment that UK, Italy, and Japan are doing, that's a different level of cooperation. And I think that's fine. I think we should tailor different levels of cooperation to the capability of different partners.
Professor Mori, do you think a free and open Indo-Pacific that lots of different countries can sign up to, is that gaining traction, or is it still sort of wishful thinking?
I think the term free and open Indo-Pacific has permeated through not only the Indo-Pacific region, but also beyond. And I think this is a reflection of this sort of a sense of uncertainty felt by many countries. Where are we heading? And many countries have actually come to conclude that they want a rules-based order. Basically, this means, in the Japanese version, this basically means an international order rooted in three basic principles. One is freedom, second is rule of law, and the third is connectivity. And I think under these three principles, many countries have actually probably are able to kind of sign up to this. They have different versions of their own Indo-Pacific visions or outlook or whatever maybe strategy and so forth. But there is this basic notion that all countries would want to be free from coercion and force. And they would rather see international rules and norms such as respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, peaceful resolution of disputes, and non-use of force be honored and upheld. And also connectivity. Everybody wants to achieve economic growth. So they want to enhance and invigorate economic interaction, commercial activities, and also people-to-people exchange. And so this is the basic vision for an international order that Japan actually proposed initially. And I think different countries do have different versions, but more or less, I think they share this kind of vision. The way we advance and sort of pursue this vision differs from country to country. But I think it has sort of resonated with other regional states. And these various kinds of security partnerships and cooperative frameworks that we're having, on a not only bilateral but on a multilateral basis, these are all vehicles to actually achieve this vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And speaking to the security aspect that Teraoka-san was talking about, different regional states have different security needs. And I think this sort of a tailored functional area-based engagement with regional states really fits in to the various kinds of differing security demands that countries have. One of the sort of common demands is maritime security. And there, I think frameworks like the Quad has launched what they call the Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative, which kind of shares maritime domain awareness information with regional states, and that helps these regional states. So rather than having a sort of a NATO-type institution-based security framework, it's, are you all in or all out? But rather having this kind of a tailored security partnerships allows countries to cooperate with each other to enhance regional security. And I think that's what's exactly happening under this FOIP framework. And everybody probably appreciates this kind of cooperation going forward. Yeah.
I think some of the initial reaction to the framework was that maybe it's a new label for China containment.
Initially,
containment.
Yeah, right.
But as Dr. Teraoka mentioned, if you're not forcing countries to choose and it's more flexible, then
and inclusive, by the way. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's better. Yeah.
And just one thing, I think it also leaves the door open for China to be free and open. That's, I think, one most important thing is, over the last decades or so, we try to make China more open and free. That's not working right now. But I think having that concept is not exclusive. The fact that it's not exclusive to China means that we would want China to be open and free. And I think that actually serves people who actually in China also. Not many people hate to be free and open.
So now let's turn to a couple of challenges facing the alliance, near term and longer term, and some things in the news are part of that. We've just had an election in Taiwan. You mentioned Taiwan a little bit earlier in the conversation. The new president takes office in May. What are the implications for what's happening in Taiwan for the alliance? And separately, what should Japan and the U.S. do together or separately to manage rising tensions in the Taiwan Strait?
Yeah, I think that Taiwan still continues to be a real issue going forward, and it kind of sharpens sort of defense or thinking of defense planners and strategy planners in Japan and United States and many countries about what to do with challenges posed by China. So President-elect Lai Ching-te has been assuring that he will continue on sort of direction of current President Tsai Ing-wen's foreign policy that's sort of moderate and standing firm against Chinese coercion, but still open to dialogue with the mainland, while also working with partners and not declaring de jure independence. That sort of hits the best tone that makes it easier for allies to work with Taiwan because Taiwan is being moderate and very reasonable in its foreign policy toward mainland. So I think the DPP victory was a good signal, despite the fact they lost. They didn't control the legislative yuan. Now Taiwan has a new House Speaker from KMT who might be a lot more pro-Taiwan, pro-mainland than DPP leadership is. So that twisted political dynamics might complicate the way the U.S. or Japan can cooperate with Taiwan if Taiwan itself doesn't have the unity over a foreign policy direction. But DPP still has executive branch and will continue to want to work with allies on defense issues because if it has the support from U.S. or Japan or other like-minded countries, when they engage dialogue with the mainland, they stand strong when they engage in dialogue with the mainland. So that's the position we want Taiwan to be. When Taiwan negotiates with the mainland, they know that they have support from other partners so that they don't necessarily have to concede too much when mainland doesn't give enough bargaining on the table. I think that's sort of the state of the relationship we want to ensure. Right now, I think societal ties between Taiwan and Japan are very strong. Political ties are also developing in a way that the leaders visiting high-level visits between Tokyo Metropolitan Governor Koike to Taiwan, or the heads of sort of LDP leadership going to Taiwan. That's very strong. That's very good. But I think going forward, I think we would have to think deeply about what Japan needs to do in terms of defense cooperation with Taiwan without provoking mainland unnecessarily. I think it's hard for Japan to do this because we don't have many changes in the government. Oftentimes when, for example, the Trump presidency came in, kind of lifted a lot of sort of taboos or sort of traditional framework to engage with Taiwan. There was a lot of controversy and provocation that probably was risky, but that also opened up, for example, for Pentagon to open its own specific Taiwan desk or Taiwan office in Pentagon. That wasn't happening before Trump presidency. So all these things that we might have to do to strengthen ties, dialogues, intelligent cooperation with Taiwan to prepare for contingency, it's not still in place. And I think Taiwan and Japan have to think deeply about what needs to be done with a lot more sense of urgency.
There's been a lot of talk about the end of the old strategic ambiguity about Taiwan. President Biden has gone up to the line pretty close to say, no, we should maybe explicitly, pledge to defend Taiwan, although that's been walked back. Is that ambiguity ending? Are we moving towards a much more explicit, promise to defend Taiwan on the part of the U.S., either alone or in partnership with others?
I think that U.S. strategic ambiguity can be kept, but needs to be clarified a little more to have better understanding of the concept itself. Strategic ambiguity is not ambiguous about its aim. It's ambiguous about the ways and means to achieve that aim. So the clear goal of the strategic ambiguity is to still preserve the stability of the Taiwan Strait and support the peaceful resolution of cross-strait differences. But the way to achieve that aim, whether U.S. would come to defend Taiwan and provide arms and provide forces there, that's sort of left unclear. But I think it can be sort of articulated, and I think by doing so, support Taiwan's sort of vibrant democracy, that if they do not provoke and do not act and provoke a Chinese invasion by themselves, but still, try to preserve their own democracy and do not declare de jure independence and do their own defense efforts, then I think has back and support by like-minded countries if they face unprovoked belligerence from the mainland. So I think those conversations should happen. And it's very natural that US is having, or even Japan is having that conversation. I think Japan also has to keep in mind what's clear from that policy and what's not clear. So that's just my 2 cents.
Professor Mori, what about you? You mentioned Taiwan as being quite central to the change in Japan's defense posture and how the alliance is going to work around that, freeing up the United States to focus on Taiwan while Japan can defend itself. I mean, does that suggest a much more explicit commitment? And where will Japan fit in a contingency?
Basically, Japan's central role would be to defend itself and support U.S. operations. And this is going to be critical for the United States, any U.S. operations to defend Taiwan. So that is the central role, I think, for Japan. Moving forward, I think the United States will continue to support Taiwan's effort to build up its own defense capabilities and also resilience. And together, between Japan and the United States, we will probably have to do 2 things. One is to deter a sort of a short, sharp war to take over Taiwan. And the second is also to demonstrate our resilience so that we will be able to withstand even a protracted war. And this is going to be a major, major challenge, not only for Japan, but also for the United States as well. And here, I think we have to work not only on the hardware side, by hardening bases and infrastructure and so forth, but also build upon the public opinion. And it's going to be too late after a crisis erupts and you start talking how Taiwan security is going to be important for Japanese security. I think there needs to be a much more deeper debate about what Taiwan security means for Japan. Japanese public will probably have to think about how the world would change if Taiwan falls under Chinese control. And that is going to change dramatically Japan's security environment. And I think the United States will be in a much more difficult position to defend Japan, and also South Korea, by the way. And so it's going to be a sort of a dramatic reduction in Japanese security if that happens. And so there needs to be much more public awareness on this issue to build up resilience on the public opinion part. And those 2 efforts will probably have to move forward. 2 outstanding issues. One is, how should we be dealing with Chinese military coercion against Taiwan, which is already happening. I don't think we have a sort of a strategy to deal with that kind of counter coercion.
You're talking about pressure short of
pressure short of actual attack. Yeah, exactly. And right now, Chinese military aircraft make incursions into the southwest air defense identification zone of Taiwan. And every time there's some incident or an effort on the part of the United States and Taiwan to enhance their defense cooperation, China does that. And it remains a significant challenge, but we don't really have a plan how to deal with that. And so, one of the possible argument that can be made about how to deal with this is that if China continues this kind of military coercion, the relationship between U.S., Japan, and Taiwan will have to evolve. Meaning that this is the second outstanding issue, which is about how do we communicate with the Taiwanese and cooperate with Taiwan in order to prepare for any sort of contingency. And we don't have any official dialogue or strategic dialogue with Taiwan. But if the current pattern continues and begins to cause serious, significant adverse effects on Taiwan, I think there needs to be, at some point, a new step that would open up new avenues for much deeper and stronger defense cooperation between Japan, United States, and Taiwan. And I hope it doesn't come to that, but policymakers and defense planners will inevitably have to think about that. And even before there is any sort of major incident, this issue is already serious enough. So if current Chinese behavior continues, I think there should be under the surface, completely classified setting. There should be a sort of a security dialogue in the United States, perhaps, between Japan, United States, and Taiwan, maybe. And also perhaps involve Australia as well, perhaps. Yeah. So that would be my argument for this issue. Yeah.
One of the many things that would come into play in that is, of course, U.S. domestic politics and the appetite for something like that. You talked about, Dr. Teraoka, the divisions in the U.S. society, being perhaps at the top of the list of destabilizing risks to the alliance right now. Those divisions are about to be tested again in an election in November. We've been through one Trump administration. I'm not going to ask you to predict the outcome of the election, but if you could talk broadly about the risks that it presents, what might happen if we have a second Trump administration, and what the continuing strength of that movement in American society, which includes a more isolationist way of thinking. I mean, what does that mean for the long-term prospects of the security environment and the alliance?
Yeah, I think the first Trump presidency, Japan managed to sort of fend off direct attack because of good partnership between Mr. Abe and Mr. Trump. But I think under the surface, people who managed that partnership knew how tenuous that could have been, right? Because if two leaders don't get along, then that's over. And then it wasn't sustainable way of managing partnership, but that was almost the only way. So next presidency, we would have to rethink again how to manage that, because it's I don't know if our prime minister can forge the same type of partnership with Trump, or Trump would behave the same way as he did in the past. So it's really hard to say how Trump will engage in foreign policy. It depends on who surrounds Trump and what kind of sort of domestic political environment he faces at the time. But one thing I can say is that U.S. has the separation of power, and that's sort of saving grace sometimes, because you can slow down the initiative by a president sometimes by engaging with congressional members and federal governments. So I think many allies will continue to engage with United States and then try to shape the direction of U.S. foreign policy. That's sort of the way that U.S. allows sort of voices from other countries to be involved in open society and shape U.S. foreign policy. So that's, I would say, is going to happen. And that's what I think other allies will continue to do. But last time, I think Australia, South Korea, or continental European powers had much more difficult time than Japan in dealing with President Trump. Next time, I think that just reinforces the notion that foreign policy led by Trump is not just one-off thing. It might continue to be like that going forward. So that just necessitates these countries, allies, to work among each other and try to hedge a little bit. But working among each other and continuing current foreign policy will still be the sort of direction we have to. And then we will try to shape the U.S. foreign policy to the extent we can. But that's sort of the way we are going to work with what comes out of elections that will be decided by people in America. And then that also includes Taiwan. Sometimes people in Taiwan feels like they are just derivatives of U.S. domestic politics or Sino-U.S. relationship. But I think for Japan, Taiwan security, as Mori Sensei was saying, it's not easily divisible from Japanese security. So I think as Japan works with its like-minded partners, it would also have to work with Taiwan, and it will have to continue to involve Taiwan in various security framework or economic frameworks to the extent we can, even if Trump gets elected again.
And Shinzo Abe was one of the few leaders of an American allied democratic country that forged a good relationship with President Trump. He's sort of seen almost as a Trump whisperer at a very uncertain time. But it's not just about two leaders. And I think you talked about hedging. It's not just Japan; it's other countries looking at the United States and thinking about its divisions and the movement that brought Trump to power, and wondering how that affects America's long-term thinking, its long-term reliability, and probably feeding some of that hedging. Is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so. And but it's, I think, also important to look at continuity in U.S. foreign policy as well. I mean, I think the technological regulation surrounding, for example, technology will probably continue regardless of what kind of administration you have in the United States. Probably China's strategy as well. I think there will be likely to be more focus on the economic negotiations vis-a-vis U.S.-China relations if you have a second Trump presidency rather than the security dimension. But we'll have to see. And one of the areas where we are likely to see a sort of a dramatic change in the shift in the policy with regard to the administration changes related to climate and also Middle East. And here, I think a second Trump presidency might take a rather different stance from the Biden administration. I think in the area of climate, I don't think the Republican Party is as enthusiastic as the Democratic Party in pushing forward all the green initiatives that President Biden has promoted. And in the Middle East, I think the Trump administration could likely be more sort of supportive of Israel while being more hawkish on Iran. And so that could be some sort of, they both engage the Middle East, but the emphasis of where they focus could be different. And so, as a result of this two-party having different outlooks about what issues they should focus on, there are continuities and change. And in some areas of change, I think there will be fluctuations, and not only Japan, but also NATO allies in Europe will have to manage this kind of fluctuation in U.S. foreign policy. And this fluctuation actually undermines, I think, U.S. commitment power. Because, for example, if the Trump administration were to withdraw from the Paris Accords, every time you have a Democratic administration making commitments to the Green Initiative, the other country will think that, well, if you have a succeeding Republican administration, they will revoke that initiative. And so that kind of erodes U.S. power to credibly commit to a particular foreign policy issue. And so that's probably one of the consequences of having a sort of a politically polarized U.S. society, having two different parties coming up with two different priorities. Yeah.
Before we wrap up, I want to give you both a chance to, give your final prescriptions, final pieces of advice. If you are sitting in Washington or Tokyo as a policymaker, what do you think the top priorities should be looking ahead to strengthen the alliance, make it more effective and more relevant?
I think the primary issue that policymakers need to work on is to do their own homework. I think each country has its own homework in terms of defense or security or cyber or economic security. I think making progress on those issues is definitely one thing they can do, regardless of other countries' domestic political environment. Yeah, I think that the China challenge continues to loom large in defining the security environment of Indo-Pacific. I think as China looks to outside to engage in dialogues with various countries, that I think starts offering sort of challenges and then sort of opportunities for cleavages among allies. So that becomes more important. It makes it more important for allies to talk more and to coordinate policies more as China becomes more open to the outside and becomes more friendly to the outside. I think that will be a challenge going forward, is that when China is being vigilant, it's easy for allies to cooperate. I think when China becomes targeting various countries to open up path and diplomatic avenues, which is important. I think these countries should have dialogue with China, but I think continuing to exchange notes and continue coordinating policies will become important challenge going forward.
I think the first point that Teraoka-san said, I agree. With regard to the strategic documents that were adopted in December 2022. It's implementation, implementation, implementation. So that's going to be the main agenda. This is Japan, yes, yes, and also cooperation with the United States, yeah. But under that umbrella, I would point to maybe 2 or 3 specific initiatives. And one is to sort of realize this new command and control cooperation between architecture for Japan-US defense cooperation. And that has to do with the Japan Joint Operations Center and also this new US forces headquarters that is going to be established under the Indo-Pacific Command. So that's one thing. Second, on the security side, I would point to, this is a new idea that I've been pitching, 2+2+2 for Japan, US, Australia. I think Australia will become increasingly important strategically in enhancing deterrence vis-a-vis China in the Indo-Pacific region. And here I think Japan, United States, and Australia should coordinate not only command and control, but also joint capability development and so forth. So the defense and foreign policy leaders of the 3 countries should come together and issue a joint statement to express that there are multinational balancing efforts being undertaken, to send a message to China that their effort to sort of achieve military dominance in the Western Pacific will be met by multinational balancing. And the 3 countries will probably be at the core of this balancing effort, and to sort of compel China that this is not worth, arms race is not the way to go, and that it's better to engage in arms control negotiation. And I don't think this is going to come anytime soon, but I think it's important that we keep sending that message to China. Yes. Technology cooperation. U.S. makes unilateral decision to regulate what technologies must not be exported to China. And it comes to U.S. allies and tell us not to backfill. I think there should be a joint decision-making process where before making U.S. unilateral decision, they should also involve critical U.S. allies that have critical technology that should not be exported to China or any other country of concern. And there, that kind of joint decision-making regarding technological regulation is something that is probably better serve U.S. interests and also U.S. allies' interests. I'm confident that they will come to a common conclusion, but I think the procedure is very, very important. So I hope that kind of effort will be undertaken also.
So thanks very much for being with me today, and a special thanks to Dr. Teraoka for joining us from New York. It was a really interesting conversation. I know I learned a lot. I hope our audience did too. So thank you for joining us, and goodbye.